Bun venit la ediția de astăzi a emisiunii Punctul de Plecare, filmată la Institutul Teologic Adventist de la Cernica, cu ocazia unei conferințe teologice europene. Invitatul meu de astăzi, dr. Daniel Heintz, este directorul arhivelor istorice ale Bisericii Adventiste din Europa, aflată în campusul Universității Friedensau, Germania. Ca de obicei, când un invitat este pentru prima dată în emisiunea noastră, vom parcurge traseul spiritual și profesional al acestuia. Apoi vom discuta importanța cunoașterii istoriei timpurii a bisericii noastre ca sursă de înțelepciune și de apreciere pentru personalitățile și evenimentele pozitive, dar și de avertismente care vin din paginile ei negative. Vă doresc o vizionare cu folos a interviului cu dr. Daniel Heintz. Dear Dr. Heintz, thank you very much for coming again in this program. We had already a conversation and I feel we have much more to discuss about. Leading historical research about the Adventist Church in Europe, of course we find many beautiful pages in our history, but from time to time I think we have to pause and to think on difficult times, to see how our church faced those difficult times, and not so much in order to, to criticize our forebears, but to look also into the future and to ask ourselves, are we better prepared if such a critical time comes again?
Yes.
And of course, one of the most terrible crises which hit Europe, including churches, including Adventist Church, was the National Socialism, the Nazi period in Germany, and influencing the whole of Europe. At that time, Germany was a very Christian country, a very devout country still, maybe, and the Adventist Church was very strong in Germany.
Yes.
For sure, Germany had the largest number of Adventists in the whole of Europe. So it's quite interesting to see. At the time of coming to power of the National Socialist Party, and of Hitler, of course.
Yes.
How did the churches react? The historical churches, the free churches, the Adventist Church. Give us a broad overview. And then, as I said, I like to focus mainly on the lessons we learn from that and what we should do to be better prepared if such a time comes again.
Well, this is a very complex question, but we need first to look at the general church history.
Yes.
Germany experienced a terrible defeat during the First World War. And Germans in some way felt after all these arrangements, political arrangements after the war were made, Germany felt a little bit like it was not dealt fairly,
they have been humiliated.
They felt humiliated, and they felt that the way the Allies dealt with Germany was not in a fair way. And so in many parts of Germany, there, a certain wave of nationalism started. And Hitler was using this spirit of the times in a way, and he was trying to unify Germany again on this national platform. And he said to the people that Germany is a strong nation and we should be united again. And he brought some interesting, developments we had at that time in Germany and in Austria as well. At this time, as countries were still apart, we had unemployment. People were dissatisfied, and Hitler created a new national vision for the people. And it was mainly this nationalism that caught the people, and so many churches in the beginning, also the big churches, the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church, were supporting Hitler because they saw that Hitler is making Germany strong again, And when Hitler took over in 1933, the churches were not really prepared to face this new challenge. They were impressed by nationalism. I'm not saying National Socialism, I'm saying nationalism. Because the churches wanted to have a strong Germany. It's just a natural, desire. And they were siding with Hitler. But of course, Hitler from the very beginning had not a Christian outlook. He was using some Christian terminology. He himself was a strict vegetarian. He was interested in health questions. But of course, he was driven from another force, not from a Christian attitude. But in a way, the churches, I would say, were blind. They still supported Hitler, and when Hitler started to build up the German military machine, yes, this was just a preparation for the war. Some people recognized this will be a big problem in the future. Hitler is leading us into war. And they became more aware of the development. And mainly you have in Germany, for example, in the Lutheran Church, you have these two branches. You have an official church called the Deutsche Christen, and you have the Bekennende Kirche with the Barmer Erklärung, and they were more in opposition to Hitler. And
excuse me, this name, Deutsche Christen, was the traditional name, or it was a name adopted about that time?
It was adopted at that time.
Oh, so yes, even in a way, the name of the church was adjusted.
Yes.
That was very interesting.
Yes. And you see, the Lutheran Church, in a way, was more maybe open for this national movement than the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was international, yes, and was more careful, yes. And from its structure, Catholicism is a hierarchical church. They were a little bit more bound together than the Lutheran Church. But we can see the same development also in the smaller churches. We see that many Christians in the smaller churches, they were blinded by the rise of Germany again to power and this nationalism, and Germany became again an important country with a working good economic system and so on and so on, and people were blinded, and also in the smaller churches, we observe these two directions.
And I also have another question.
Yes.
I think about the same time. I mean, before the rise of Hitler to power, German communists were significantly growing, and I think churches had another reason
Yes.
for taking the side
Yes,
of...
thank you for making this point,
Yeah.
because this is very important. Hitler was always warning. He said we need to be aware of the Bolshevik danger, you know, of the danger of communism. And I know that when you read the books, the history books at that time, the churches were warning and said, you know, if we don't resist, you know, communism, we will have the same problems that Christians have now in the Soviet Union. So we need to be aware of this. And Hitler was using this, you know.
Do you think it was totally true, or it was also some propaganda? It was some manipulated...
Both, of course. Both. It was manipulation,
but it was
also true.
It was a real danger.
It was a real danger. When we look at the church in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, it was the time of the Stalinist purges, you know. So many Christians lost their lives. And Hitler used this as an argument to show that we need to do something to fight this Bolshevik threat.
I am your savior.
Yes, and I'm your savior, you know. And if we don't do something, they will do something, and we need to be aware of this. Yes.
So it was a very difficult time.
Yes.
Christians had, as we say sometimes, to choose between two evils, not good and evil, between two evils.
Yes. It was a very, very difficult time. Yes, please.
So you say that both historical churches and the free churches tended to support, at least for a while, Hitler, being both for nationalistic
national reasons, for his national appeal,
and also as a
protection
about the atheist communism, which could take them over from the Soviet Union. In the beginning, Hitler was not very explicit about his racist ideas, about his desire, his plans to wipe out some certain races of peoples.
Of course, he had this plan from the very beginning, you know. But many Christians were not really studying this ideology in detail. They knew about this anti-Jewish attitude. They saw that Jews were even taken away. But they thought, as a pastor told me, who lived in this time, they thought that these Jews are just settled somewhere else, you know, to work in another part of the country, in the East, in Eastern Europe. And you know, they saw this, but they did not ask. Don't forget, it was a dictatorship. It was not a democracy, you know. There was no free press. And so people were a little bit careful, you know. And they saw what was happening, but they were careful. And they said, you know, we need to be careful.
To protect ourselves.
To protect ourselves.
And our churches.
Exactly.
Was there... I don't know really, in some parts of Europe, some parts of the world, there were already some anti-Jewish sentiments in the population.
Yes.
Was to some degree the case in Germany as well before the rise of...
Well, we had these anti-Jewish attitudes throughout our history, you know, but they were not a program, a political program, you know.
The popular sentiment of
it was a popular sentiment of the people. We find this anti-Semitism in almost all countries of Europe, unfortunately. But Hitler developed a racist program, you know, to exterminate,
in a systematic way.
To systematically exterminate the Jewish race, you know. And this was, of course, a terrible program, and the church was not prepared to stand up against this program, you know. In fact, the churches I would not say that the churches were actively, I'm talking now about the smaller churches,
Yes.
particularly about the Adventist Church. I would not say that these churches actively supported Hitler. They did not support Hitler. They were impressed by the national rise of Germany, but they saw that Hitler is not a Christian, not at all. He is a tyrann, he is a dictator. But they were afraid. They had not the courage to oppose him. Because, you know, in 1933, for example, in the case of the Adventists, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he forbade the existence of the Adventist Church for 2 or 3 weeks. Adventist organization was dissolved in Germany.
Specifically the Adventist
Specifically the Adventist
not
Church.
other churches.
Other churches also, but from the free churches, mainly the Adventists.
Oh.
There were some smaller, like the Reformed Adventists or the
Yeah.
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
Probably
they were
they're
also
quite small.
smaller groups were also dissolved, but the Adventist Church was the only free church that was dissolved. And until today, we don't know the exact reasons. You know. Why we were dissolved? Was it because the authorities mixed us up with the Jews because we keep the Sabbath and we don't eat
Unclean,
pork,
yeah,
unclean
pork.
food? Yes, we don't know. We don't know. But after that, the church was then admitted again. Yes, but the church leaders were very much shocked. And they were very careful now. One of the church leaders said, the sword of Damocles was over our head all this time because we were afraid that the same will happen again.
Yeah.
And so the church chose a strategy of survival.
Survival.
It was not done out of conviction. I'm not saying that the members, the Adventist members, were convinced. No, not at all. They did not support Hitler, you know, but they were afraid. And they thought if we do not comply, if we do not adapt, then we will lose our institutions. At that time, Germany, the Adventist Church in Germany had some important institutions. We had 2 seminaries,
Yeah.
and we had a hospital, and we had other institutions, you know. And they were afraid if we resist, then the Gestapo will come and will close our institutions. And so they just adapted, not out of conviction, but out of a survival strategy, you know.
Yeah, you mentioned that that was the approach or the attitude, the reaction of the main churches and the majority in the different churches. But you also mentioned that there was a different approach. Probably that was a minority. You mentioned in the Lutheran Church, the Barmen.
Yes, the Barmer Erklärung
Yeah.
and the Bekennende Kirche, they had very strong convictions, and they resisted this development.
In numbers, what was the
Well, the Bekennende Kirche was a minority, of course.
a small minority?
A smaller minority, yes. It was a smaller minority. They had some prominent theologians like Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
Yes.
but it was a minority. The main body of the church also adapted, yes. And of course, it was also a little bit easier for these churches because these churches were not so strict, for example, like the free churches in the military question. Yes, serving as a soldier was no problem for them, but it was a problem for Adventists.
Yes.
You know, we took the commandments seriously. We don't want to kill. We don't want to serve on Sabbath.
Yes.
So for us, there was always a constant struggle with the authorities because of these questions. Yes.
And returning to the witnessing church, Bonhoeffer, what was their approach? They resisted on what reasons? What were they trying to do?
Well, they opposed Hitler and National Socialism because they said that Christianity is not a national movement. It is an international movement. We don't want to speak about religion and Jesus Christ in national or racist terms. Especially they were opposed to the persecution of Jews during the Nazi time. They saw that National Socialism is an atheistic program, you know, a worldview, and is not compatible with Christianity, with the commandments of God, with the commandments of love. They were really, they had a very clear view of the political developments.
So what they did actually? They
well, they went underground.
They went underground.
They went underground. They did not share the different programs that the government was issuing. They did not send the pastors to the different how can I say, seminars, yes, that the government was offering. They were preaching openly. There was censorship, of course. You could not preach openly, you could not write openly, but they spoke about this, yes, about the persecution of Jews and so on. So they were quite courageous.
Oh, they also developed their own seminary.
They also developed their own seminary. They had their own theological education. They had their own pastors, and it was a separate church actually. Yes.
Quite risky.
Quite risky.
And I imagine many.
Yes, and many of them were finally, eventually, were arrested, and some of them lost their lives. Yes. Because of their conviction.
Among the free churches were also pastors or believers, individual believers, who also took a position of resistance.
Yes, yes.
In a more an open or a quieter way.
Well, we should not forget, of course, that the smaller churches were not in a very strong political position.
Yes.
They had no political power.
Yeah.
The big churches, of course, were more powerful. The smaller churches, most of them, as I said, adapted, yes, and kept quiet or looked away, unfortunately. But there were some courageous church members. I would not say church leaders. They had this difficult task to mediate. Yes. Between the government and the church basis. But we have church members who lived and acted according to their conscience. And they said, I cannot bear or use an arm. I cannot wear a uniform. And so they risked their lives, and some of them died in concentration camps. They were shot because of their faith. In this case, I should also mention the Reform Adventists. They were courageous, but sometimes they think they were the only ones who resisted, which is not true. There were a sizable group of Adventist members from the official church who resisted. And just recently we have collected the information because these members were lost. The knowledge about these members was lost, you know. So we tried to collect biographical information about these members, what happened exactly. We looked for the documents, for the legal documents and so on and so on. And we put together the short biographies about these martyrs that died for their faith. because they rejected to bear arms or to work on Sabbath. And I think we should not forget their witness. It is a strong witness, you know, and they should be an example for us in the future, that we should learn, yes, from history. Adaptation can be a big problem.
Yeah.
If we make compromises, we can really destroy our faith.
We return, of course, to that because this is the main thrust of our conversation. But before doing that, you mentioned some issues which were of special interest to Christians, like a pacifist attitude or not accepting to go to kill others. For Adventists, of course, it was the issue of the Sabbath, especially in the military. But there was another issue where Christians were expected and sometimes required, or they had to comply with the racial laws. They were supposed to denounce the Jews, so they knew.
Yes, yes.
And so what did
Yes,
the Christians...
well, this is a very dark chapter in church history. The mainline churches and also the smaller churches did, in many cases, not support the Jews, you know, and we need to study this, because as Christians we have high moral values, but we can see that when we come into a big temptation, that we may even lose sight of these moral standards, biblical standards that we have. In fact, the Adventist Church in Germany excluded some members of Jewish origin. They were just excluded because they were Jews. And the church was afraid that if they don't do this, they would be dissolved as a body, you know. And so they denounced some of their members and excluded, disfellowshipped them, you know. And we have the case of one man. He was a church elder. His name was Max Munk. He was a Jew who became an Adventist. And in this difficult time, the church decided to disfellowship him with his wife. It's only one example. And he was put in 2 concentration camps. You know, for a while, when he was still not in the camp, but excluded from the church, he still continued to pay tithes. He gave his offerings.
So he was not bitter?
He was not bitter. No, he was not bitter.
Incredible.
He continued. Whereas the pastor said, please have no contact with Jewish members, but he would still support the church. But he ended up in 2 concentration camps. But he survived. He survived. And after the war, he asked to be readmitted with his family to the church. And the church did not apologize. He was again taken into the Adventist fellowship. And when he was asked privately what he thinks about all, you know, about the history that he experienced, he said, you know, I'm not here to criticize the church leaders, because I know under which terrible pressure they stood. I'm here to work for reconciliation, and I want to forgive my brothers and sisters, and I want to support them. So he was a true Christian. He was a true Christian, and he was readmitted to the church. And his daughter still lives in Friedensau, in our senior home, and she told me that story. You know, she showed me the documents, and I thought for myself, you know, this man has really fully understood what Christianity is all about. Reconciliation, forgiveness, love. In spite of the terrible experience that he made. You know?
He was treated very unjustly.
And you know, this is not the only case. There are a few more cases that really are a moral burden for us. So the church decided in 2005, officially, I think it was rather late, 60 years after the war, they decided to issue a public declaration of guilt, you know. So I think, to my knowledge, it is the first declaration of this kind that we ever made in the history of the Adventist Church, officially, admitting that the Church has made a mistake, and the Church is asking these people that went through this experience, the children of these people and so on, they asked for forgiveness, and they said, you know, this was a big moral failure. But we are human beings, and we all live from God's grace, and we ask for forgiveness, and we want to learn for the future so that this will not happen again. So this is a big lesson that our church learned from history.
We'll return to that, but I'd like to explore a little more what happened with those minority groups which took a stand either about not complying with the rules, or even to be more active, you know, resisting or fighting or preaching against those wrong ideologies and policies. You mentioned already the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was already a very well-known theologian, and I think about that time he was invited to teach in an American university, and he went. But when he observed the developments, he felt he has no right to stay away, and he deliberately returned to Germany. So in a way, he returned to hell.
But you see, Bonhoeffer, he was an atheist, and he said that a Christian does not live in an empty room. You know, he lives in a society. He has to take societal and political responsibility. You know. And this is something we can learn from Bonhoeffer. Sometimes we tend, as Adventists, we tend to withdraw a little bit from the world. You say, because we say, oh, we have nothing to do with the world, you know. But in a dictatorship, this withdrawal ends up in adaptation. You see, so we need to really analyze political developments and be open and look where they lead. You know, we cannot just withdraw into a neutral little place for ourselves. And Bonhoeffer was convinced that a Christian has also a political responsibility, and he was urging this very much. You know, and it led to his involvement into this resistance movement in Germany, and finally. In 1944, when all this opposition against Hitler failed, he was arrested. And
it was after an attempt, a failed attempt,
to kill,
to assassinate Hitler, and he was involved into that.
In July 1944, he was involved into that, and of course, by doing this, he risked his life.
He knew that.
He knew that.
It was deliberate.
Yes, he said that I have to do this. You know, he was in a way justifying this principle that you can, if it is necessary, kill a dictator to prevent that more people, millions of people, or hundred thousands of people will be killed in the war. You know, so he was convinced of this, and he sacrificed his life. He was put into a concentration camp in Flossenbürg, and he died was
About
killed.
3 weeks before.
Just shortly before the
fall
war
of-
ended.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. You mentioned that we Adventists sometimes tend to withdraw. Maybe one reason we do that is that we give a higher place to our distinctives,
Yes.
Sabbath.
Yes. And to
we
the
say-
Gospel Commission.
Yeah, and
We
in
say,
order to do that,
yes,
we better keep quiet on
Yes.
political
yes,
issues.
but this is a danger.
Mhm.
We are not from this world,
Yeah.
but we live in this world. And we cannot be blind to political developments. And I think when we study prophecy, yes, prophecy shows us where the world is going, yes, heading. And so we need to be aware of political developments. It does not mean that we need to get involved politically like Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
Yeah.
but we need to be aware, not to make these pitfalls that happened, like when it comes to the treatment of Jews. Yes, we need to be aware of this. We need some I put this under question mark, some political awareness.
Yes, yes. You said it already several times, and I'd like to devote the time remaining of our conversation to lessons we should take from what happened then. And,
well, one,
yes.
if I may interrupt, one big lesson is that, of course, it applies to Germany, yes, but the church is always more ready to adapt to the spirit of the times than to repent. You see, we try to adapt. It was in the First World War the problem with military, you
Yes.
know, and we had an offshoot movement during that time. The Second World War, again, of course, under pressure politically, the church adapted, you know, and we had these failures, big moral failures. And I tend to say that even in our modern times, we sometimes adapt to the spirit of the times. We don't do it under pressure because we're living in a free society, but we do it because we want to be modern. We want to be, we were a little bit pluralistic. We feel comfortable. So the Christian church adapts again to the spirit of the times, yes? And we need to be careful because it is not the spirit of the times which is our foundation. The coming of the Lord, the Bible, is our foundation. We need to interpret the spirit of the times from the perspective of the Bible, and not the other way around. You see? And this is one of the big lessons that we can learn from history, I think.
Yeah. You mentioned already our prophetic understanding, and in this respect, so what is our understanding of the way things may go in the future? We see already that the whole planet is very, very much interconnected.
Yes, yes, yes.
The times when one country should be in war and another country would prosper, or another country would even would know about what's going there, are gone. Now, the whole planet is interconnected. Yes. Something happens here, immediately we have a reaction on the opposite part of the planet.
Yes, yes. We live in a very interesting time. We live in a global world. We live in a global world. And I think as Adventists, we can use this, of course, to spread the biblical message very effectively. But what we need is actually a revivalism, that we are really aware, not only by our mind intellectually, but by our whole existence as Christians, we need to be authentic Christians. We need to show that Christ is the center of our life. It's not just a theory. He lives within our hearts, and we are waiting for his return. And we need to tell this to the world. The world, even though we live in a global society, we have all kinds of mass media and all kinds of informations that we can get. But the world does not talk about the second coming.
Yeah.
This is our responsibility as Christians to preach the second coming of Christ as the solution of the world problems.
Yes.
And this is especially the task of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that we prepare the world for the second coming of Christ.
So we can expect difficult times in the future.
Yes,
We don't know
yes.
exactly the scenario.
Yes,
we
yes,
don't know
yes.
exactly where and
Yes,
when
yes.
and how, what will be the issues precisely. But difficult times are going to...
Yes, and we need to be prepared for this. And I think when we look back, we can draw lessons from history, and that's why history is so important. You know, we can look into the Bible is a history.
Yeah.
A history how God has dealt with his church, with his people, with Israel in the Old Testament and with the church in the New Testament. So it is history. We see how God is dealing, acting with man, and we can learn from this. And I think we have nothing to fear in the future as Christians, because we know that God is leading everything to a good end. And the world, even though we are sometimes afraid when we look into the world, we see these difficult developments with the problems in the world, but we know that the world will not be destroyed in chaos. The world will not disappear in chaos, but we know that God will create a new cosmos, you know, a new world, and this is a big hope. And I would say this is the relevance of Christianity, of Adventism, today and tomorrow.
You mentioned several times that the churches that time in Germany, it was not only Germany,
Yes.
more or less it
Yes.
happened in other places as well, but Germany, of course, is the most conspicuous example. We're blind to what was going on. What would be for us some whistleblowers, some alarm sounds to tell us, be careful, this is not right. What signs should make us be vigilant?
Well, we need to look into, for example, political developments very carefully, especially when you have a political development and a church development. When church and politics work hand in hand, you know, when this unity is here, and at the expense, for example, of other groups, we need to be careful. Yes. Also, from the Bible, we know that there will be this unification of churches. When I think of ecumenism, we need to be careful. There are many developments where we need to be aware as Christians that these unifying spirits, you know, when it comes to world religion, this syncretism, this mixture of religions, these unifications, is always at the expense of biblical truth, you know. So it is the biblical basis on which we stand and from which we have to analyze political developments and church developments. Yes.
Yeah, but usually when such an alliance between governments and a certain church or a certain denomination, typically those who suffer are Christians or religion people we don't like anyway. We also have something to
Yes.
say about them.
Yes.
So maybe we are careless. Well, they deserve it.
Yes.
Is
yes.
that a good spirit? Because that was
Yes, but this was the thinking. This was the thinking that we exactly experienced during the Third Reich.
Yeah.
You know, we said as Christians, the Jews, they deserve it.
Yeah.
They killed the Messiah.
Yeah.
So this is their fate. You know, this is a judgment.
They asked it for themselves.
They asked for it. You know, they killed Jesus. They asked for it. But we need to be very careful. You know, it is always important to see how a government treats the minorities. You can see the strength of a government in the way they treat minorities, you know. So I think this is also a lesson that we have to learn. When a government, a country does not treat minorities in a fair way, this is dangerous, you know, and we need to be aware of this.
And I think if we tolerate in our own soul enmity or bitterness toward any group, any individual, any race, any religion, that makes us vulnerable, because one day someone will come and will say, we'll get rid of them. And if I tolerate it in my own heart, hatred, I'm not going to oppose government to protect them.
Exactly.
So hatred is a very dangerous thing.
It's a very dangerous. It's really, it is a source of evil. Yes. But in a way, you see, we as Adventists, we are champions of religious freedom, of tolerance. And we should not only claim this for ourselves, we should also give it to other people.
Even to those we disagree doctrinally.
Exactly. This is a human right, you know. Everybody is free and can decide. God is free and He lets us to decide.
Yeah, well, that makes me remember that about almost 20 years ago, when here in Romania the discussions about a new legislation on the religious denominations, and the existing churches have been were invited from time to time to participate in these conversations, and we were able to express our views, and the government was trying to take into consideration our propositions, our objections, and things like that. But at one time, this topic came to be discussed. What if new denominations will seek for recognition? And I was part for a while of that discussion. I was perplexed when I saw almost unanimity of the representatives of the registered churches doing all in their power to prevent other denominations to be registered. As if freedom is up to my level, but from now on, you see,
this cannot work. This is not the spirit of Christ. So we need to be tolerant. The tolerance that we claim for us need to be granted, extended to other people as well.
So it was not a very critical issue. It was nothing about persecution. It was no pressure. But the spirit comes out when we face, such situations. You mentioned the fact that especially the leaders of the churches were in difficult positions, because it was not just about themselves. They felt a duty,
a responsibility
for all their believers, and also to protect that little freedom they had. But maybe they didn't make the right choices.
Well, it is, you see, it is very easy, of course, to criticize. We live today in a secure, we are in a secure position. It's easy to criticize people that lived in a in an authoritarian
yeah.
regime.
But how to get?
But the question is still there:
Yeah,
how to react, and everybody needs to follow his conscience. You know, I think the leaders in their mind they said, we don't want to make the Adventist Church a martyr church.
Yes.
We still need the young men for spreading the gospel after the war. If we lose them all as martyrs, or if we lose our institutions, of course this was the responsibility they felt. And I think we cannot make general rules how to live in this special situation. We need to pray. We need to ask God for His guidance, and we need to decide from case to case what to do. But I think that I am now speaking about the Adventist Church, that our leaders at that time took adaptability too far. In some way, they went too far. You know, they were in a way supporting, maybe not so much out of conviction, as I said before, as a survival tactics, but they supported the anti-Semitic programs, for example. For me, I think they went too far. You know, they wanted to show we are good students of your program. We are here. But it's not necessary. It's not necessary to sell your soul. You know, some leaders, not everyone. We need to be careful. We cannot make generalizations. This is a historian needs to really examine the situations carefully, not making generalizations. But in some cases we can say adaptability was taken too far, you know, and we have to learn from this in the future, not to make the same pitfalls again.
Our time is almost gone. I think I'll have one or more questions. When, as a conscientious church member, you observe that your leaders, as you said, go too far, what can you do? Usually we learn, we teach our people to stay united, to stick together, to trust the leaders. But when you come to the conclusion that your leaders are not going in the right direction,
well, the best thing is, of course, to speak to them, not to oppose them and not to speak about them. But I think it would be good to speak to them, you know, to have a dialogue, and to pray and to ask God for wisdom and for guidance. It is not good to keep silent or leave the church. We need to discuss it. We need to be. We are brothers and sisters in Christ. We need to come together. We need to discuss the problem in a brotherly way, you know, and this is on the basis of the Bible. Yes, well, you know, the leaderships, of course, church leaders, always tend to support, in a way, the political establishment.
Yes.
And this is a big danger. I can understand why. They want to protect the church, they feel the responsibility, but when it comes to these moral issues, they need to make a clear decision on the basis of the Bible and not compromise our faith. When we look into our history, when we compromised our faith, in the First World War, the military question, we gave up our status of conscientious objection. We participated in the war, and we faced a big crisis when the reformist movement started, and we lost many members, you know. So, and the Second World War and so on. We need to be aware of this. The Bible is our basis, and we should not compromise our faith. And when we see that our brother is in danger to compromise, we should really have a brotherly dialogue. We need to talk. We need to pray together. We need to come together and study the Bible. This is the way we should do it. Yes.
Is it safe, especially in such conditions, it is safe to give the responsibility of making decisions for you to somebody else?
No. Finally, it is up to yourself. You have to make your own decision. You have to follow your own conscience. And if God, as I said, we have martyrs in our church, not many, but there are some. The church leaders, of course, they said, don't do this, you don't need to go to the concentration camp, or you don't need to do this. But the member, I just have a young man in mind, he said, I have to follow my conscience. And the church leaders respected it and said, okay, this is your personal decision that you have taken after praying, after studying the Bible. And they respected it. And we need to respect this. And we are all, finally, when we stand before God, all we go by our conscience. We cannot say, but the church leaders, but the pastor in my church, the elder in my... No. Everyone is responsible for himself. And we can only pray and ask God that when we come into a big temptation, that He gives us the strength to keep, to be faithful, to keep the commandment of God, and to be faithful and loyal to His message, a true disciple of Christ.
Well, I think this is a good end of our conversation. I appreciate your honest discussion and the open evaluation and the lessons you helped us to draw for the future. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
În viața persoanelor, a colectivităților și a popoarelor, vine un timp în care să ne privim istoria cu o anumită detașare, cu o preocupare pentru obiectivitate și cu dorința de a ști cu adevărat ce și a înțelege cu adevărat de ce. Cred că emisiunea de astăzi a fost un exemplu și o încurajare pentru un asemenea demers, un punct de plecare pentru clarificări atât de necesare. Pe curând, la o nouă discuție pasionantă la Punctul de Plecare.